Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 2 of the Jobava London series where we're going to be talking about the g6, bishop g7, and knight f6 setup against the Jobava London system. So let's get started. After d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, and bishop f4, we're going to be covering a couple of moves. Right away, we're going to start with bishop g7. We're also going to be covering d5. And from there, we're going to be covering a bunch of subvariants and ways you can checkmate your opponent in a matter of 15-20 moves. First, let's start with bishop g7. Bishop g7 is not a good move in this position. The main move is d5, and the reason for that is that it prevents us from playing e4. With the bishop on g7 and no pawn contesting the center, we can safely play e4 and take up a lot of space. Here we can actually win the knight if our opponent doesn't play uber accurately. For example, if the opponent plays d6, we can't really win the knight, but if the opponent goes for something like castling, which is a very common move, you can simply play e5, taking this knight away and forcing it to either h5 or e8. Obviously, the knight from e8 is very passive and pretty much undeveloped. It's on a very bad square, and it cannot develop itself to either d6 or f6 because of this pawn. So that would be a very nice position. From there, we could play something like queen d2, bishop d3, potentially play bishop h6 and trade this bishop off, and we would be fine there. If your opponent plays knight h5, however, you can actually trap and win this knight. Here you simply bring the bishop back to d2. Your opponent might play something like c5, and you play g4, and now this knight is trapped. After this capture, you're going to bring your knight back to e2, and there's nothing that black can do here besides give up this knight. The same can be said about the move d5, where you can actually start a little bit differently. You can play knight b5 here, and this is one of the most common ideas in the Jobava London. That's why you put the bishop on f4 and the knight on c3 in order to set up this fork. And after the opponent plays knight a6, which is the only move that defends this fork, you can simply play e5 and kick this knight out once again. The main difference here is that black can play, knight e7 and not get his knight trapped. If knight h5, you have the exact same line. There is a slight difference. You can play bishop e3. There's no point in memorizing these, tiny nuances. You can just bring the bishop back to d2. After something like c6, knight c3, and c5, you play g4. But after this pawn capture, it's strongly advisable to not play knight e2 because in that case, you simply blunder the pawn. The difference between this and the past variation was that there was a pawn on e7 which prevented this bishop from coming out and taking this g4 pawn. So therefore, by placing a knight on e2, you block the queen's vision of the pawn, and black is a lot better here. So obviously, instead you play knight b5. This knight cannot be kicked out now, and this knight is trapped, so you would be winning. However, it's a lot more likely that your opponent simply plays knight d7, and here you simply play queen d2, and you're going to set up this queen bishop battery and try to take black's bishop and weaken black's king. After something like c6, you bring this knight back. You might get knight c7, knight f3, castles, and h4. And you start the advancement of this pawn. So generally, in a lot of these positions where black adopts a sort of king's Indian sort of setup, you're going to avoid castling kingside. You're probably going to castle queenside or not castle at all. And you're just going to march down the board with h4, h5, g4 ideas, open up this rook, and create some devastating attacks. So it's very likely here that you get met with h5, because if you don't, and let's say just a random move happens like e6, you actually have the ability to play h5 here right away, and you're going to be much, much better. Because you're going to infiltrate with your pawns, or you're going to ruin black's kingside pawn structure, which is going to be awful for black since, these pawns are responsible for the protection of black's king. But after h4, h5, you simply play bishop h6. Black cannot take your bishop because in that case, you will simply recapture with the queen, and then you can play knight g5, and this is almost force mate. For example, I'm going to play what the engine suggests that black should do in order to survive, and it's to play this knight e6 move. But in this position, you can definitely tell that white is doing much better. I mean, black is on the brink of getting checkmated. You can simply play g4, and after something like this, you can actually just play knight g5 now. If these trades occur, obviously you have this lined up. But you're definitely going to be much better in all of these positions, and I'd say it's nothing to be worried about. If your opponent takes your bishop, you're pretty much guaranteed to win this game. You can even take, a few slow moves, and you'll still be much better just because of how endangered black's king is. Now, the best way for black to play is to play c5 and challenge the center. In that case, you can simply castle queenside, and if your opponent takes your pawn, which is the most natural response, you're going to start by taking this bishop, and the purpose of that is pretty self-explanatory, as you will see. For example, after the king recaptures, you're going to take this pawn with your queen. Now, what we can notice is that there is a discovered check incoming. So, for example, if your opponent plays something random, such as a6, you can play e6, give this check. If the knight blocks, you can take this pawn. If the knight doesn't block, you simply take the knight, of course. And after something like this, you can play knight e5. You're going to be better here. Your pieces are much better placed. You're not going to essentially, win material right away, but you have abundance of activity. You're much more active, and black's king is in a lot of danger. Black has to play very, very accurately. just to maintain this position, and even then it's like plus 1.5 already. So I'd say this is a very nice situation you can end up in. And of course, your opponent doesn't have to play c5, and your opponent might play something like e6, you know, trying to solidify this sort of structure. In that case, your opponent has made a huge blunder and a huge mistake, because closing down the position is not favorable for black. Black wants to have as much activity as possible, and black wants to free this bishop by moving the knight somewhere. So by playing e6, you know, this bishop is now stuck here, and you can simply play g4 and continue marching down the board. If your opponent takes the g4 pawn, you simply play h5. You do not care about this knight. If this knight gets captured, you take this pawn, and after these trades, you can notice that this is forced mate. Of course, that's not necessarily going to happen. I mean, if your opponent decides to take this pawn, simply take the bishop, give this queen h6 check, and then play something like bishop d3, you know, line up this attack, and you're going to be checkmating your opponent in no time. Now, your opponent might also not, you know, take this knight. At the start, they might also take this pawn. In any case, if that happens, you can simply recapture with the rook. That leads to a very quick checkmate, and, you know, pretty much the same line. Honestly, in any of these positions, I don't really need to give you the theory. All these moves are very intuitive. Just realize that you have to play g4, you have to break in the center, and you don't mind sacrificing this knight because you have so much piece activity. Your queen's ready to jump in at any moment, and you're ready to checkmate your opponent pretty much instantly. So don't really worry about memorizing moves. The probability that this exact position occurs is close to none. It's very unlikely your opponent plays, you know, 15 moves of Jobava London theory, but you may encounter very similar positions. So I think it's worthwhile to understand that g4 is always a good move. h4, h5 ideas are very prevalent in these positions where your opponent plays this King's Indian style structure, and you can always play bishop h6, trade this bishop off, activate your queen, activate your rook, and win these games. Yeah, that covers d5 from the get-go. I mean, if your opponent takes too long with d5 after you've played e4, as I said, you play knight b5, follow up with e5, and you should be fine. Let's talk about a few different moves now. So after, you know, bishop f4, your opponent might play the immediate d5, which is the much better move. However, I have a very nice plan that we can use that will definitely put black to the test and force them to use their defensive skill. So we play e3, we get bishop d7, and we play h4. Why h4? Well, this is something that you will see a lot in modern day Gruenfeld games, where white plays this early h2 to h4 push. And the reason for that is black has a very difficult time defending, and you're really affecting this sort of kingside pawn structure where black plans to castle. And it's a very, very testing line for black, and it's very difficult to defend. So against h4, the best move is h5, in which case you play knight f3, and after, let's say, castles, you're going to play knight e5. I think it's more important to understand the ideas here. You're eventually going to play bishop e2 and g4. That is your ultimate goal. You can also start with queen d2 and then castling queenside. That is completely fine as well. However, if you want to create an attack, you can play bishop e2 and g4. You can also even do f3 and g4, although I would be careful to not get your knight trapped. And you might encounter something like c5 and then, you know, queen d2, knight c6. You can castle queenside. If this trade occurs, you're very much fine in that position. Nothing to really worry about. Once again, g4 is your main plan. However, you do need a bishop on e2. Sometimes even a rook on b1 if you want to accomplish this whole plan. Because if you played g4 prematurely, you're going to end up losing that pawn with the bishop and the knight both staring at the g4 square. If your opponent doesn't play h5, usually it's not too big of a deal. Let's say your opponent castles. You don't really have the ability to play h5 and punish that immediately. So you can just start with, you know, the same things that you would normally with knight f3. And then you might encounter h5 later down the line. But under the assumption that your opponent decides to never play h5, then you can eventually build up an attack with, like I said, knight e5 and g4, and then push h5. And in that case, your opponent will just be much worse, because if black allows white to play h5, the whole structure crumbles. So keep that all in mind, and you should be on your way to winning all of these games. Now let's look at bishop g7, e4, and the move d6. So d6 is a move that makes a lot of sense. This is something you will see a lot in the regular London. And the point is, well, you put this bishop on f4. I'll just put a pawn in front of it. Now your bishop, you know, is staring into my pawns. Like, what have you achieved? And in this case, we have a very nice tactic where we can play the move queen d2. And once again, we set up this bishop queen battery, and we're going to play bishop h6 and trade this bishop off. Since black has made this a bad bishop, we are going to get rid of it. An example line that you might face is something like knight c6. Here you can castle queenside once again. Generally in structures where your opponent plays, you know, this sort of King's Indian Gruenfeld style of defense, you don't want to castle kingside because you want the ability to push your kingside pawns in order to create an attack without weakening your king. So generally you're going to castle queenside. And, you know, sometimes you can play king b1 in order to reinforce these pawns further. After castling, you can play bishop h6. After e5, for example, just take the bishop and then play knight ge2. And this is the move order that Magnus Carlsen played in one of his games in the Jobava London, and he had won that game. So, you know, I would say that it's a pretty credible move order. From here, the game isn't over, of course. If your opponent doesn't take this pawn, you can push, you know, d5, and after knight d4, trade everything off and be up a pawn. If your opponent does trade, you're going to simply recapture with the knight, not the queen, of course. You don't want to blunder your queen. And I mean, the game from here continues. If this trade occurs, you're much better because of your activity. But of course, you have to still create the plans and attacks in order to secure this victory. And the plans and ideas are going to be the exact same as in the previous chapters, where you're simply going to play, g4, h4, h5. You can even play f3 and g4 to set that up. All right, guys, this summarizes what I wanted to show you for the Jobava London system and how to play against this King's Indian Gruenfeld style setup. Because these sort of variations don't have their own names, I just have to refer to them by their move order, but I still hope you guys found this very useful and enjoyed the video. And if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.